over the last several years, perhaps until recently, development was focused on regulation and rules to get approved, which makes sense, and so that obviously put the emphasis on the Food and Drug Administration, whose mission is to promote and protect the health of the public. And largely, by doing so, by evaluating the safety of efficacy of new therapies based on 2 independent and well-controlled clinical trials. So what this has kind of led to is, I think, a very narrow focused and a very narrow population looking at specific variables that may be altered by giving some sort of intervention. So another critical role that the FDA plays, in addition to evaluating the data about potential new products, is the approval of labeling associated with new products. So if you think of the scenario that we find ourselves in terms of just how much it costs to develop a drug, we're in the realm of hundreds of millions of dollars. The amount of time and effort that has to go into these, it's a very precise science in order to demonstrate as much as possible the exact effect that the drug has on the patients that are taking it. And all of this information goes into the label. Well, the label has become almost a legal document. If you've ever looked at one, maybe some of the manufacturers have. I suppose most of the rest of us haven't really examined the label. I suspect most of our physicians haven't examined the label because it may not really provide that much useful real-life information on it. And so this has sort of created a scenario where the patient and the physician may not really have information about what they can expect from taking a drug, unless you're really into hazard ratios and different statistical measures, and if you're really interested in what the ramifications of the p-value is going to be to the future of your care, then the label's a good place to look. If you really want to know what's going to happen to the patient who's taking the drug, the label may not provide the whole story. And this is a little bit of a circular problem. So it's great to hear that, that steps are being taken to try and provide more of that information about what the actual experience from taking a drug might be. And that sounds simplistic, but there's sort of an inherent problem here that when a company has to spend so much money to develop the data required to get to market, which is based on these historic clinical endpoints like for an oncology person, how does the tumor respond to the treatment? You have to pick and choose. What data are you going to collect? The more data the more data you collect, the more it costs. And so then it gets back to the labeling. How do you get patient experience data into the label? Well, the FDA has provided some guidelines to do this, but one might argue the guidelines that they put out several years ago are essentially a gold standard way of getting a patient-reported outcome into a label, and it may be virtually unattainable. So how much money in a resource-constrained area can a company put into collecting more and more data when there's no predictable path to get it into the market or into the label? And by the way, if you don't have the information in the label, it's very difficult for the company to tell anyone that it actually happened. So you're spending money to collect data that you can't communicate. So the patients are left perhaps not having a complete picture of what they might be able to expect in terms of their full spectrum of the experience with the drug. So as was noted, and Astellas talked about some of their programs that they have underway to begin to explore how to actually collect information about what patients are experiencing outside some of those traditional clinical endpoints, which I'm not trying to devalue. Obviously, we want the most effective drugs to make it to market rapidly. And so measuring some of these clinical endpoints, some of these intermediate endpoints are extremely important in doing so. But in addition to that, what ways can the external community provide venues to do this? Because of the cyclical nature of FDA perhaps not being sure what level of evidence is needed to put something in the label, companies have trouble then ascertaining what they need to conduct in their studies. It may take an outside force to come in and try and explore how to do this better. And I think that there's a real role for the advocacy community to play in this. So just a couple of areas of opportunities to consider where a growing role that patient advocates can play in this process to hopefully kind of maybe free up this log jam and try and look at methodological ways to improve the collection of data of patient experience, the communication of data about patient experience, and really help patients and their caregivers know what to expect, mitigate toxicities, and have an improved experience in taking the new medicine. So the first is a program that isn't necessarily new, but I would encourage folks that haven't been involved with it to look at it as a potential starting point. And that's the Patient-Focused Drug Development Program that was established by the FDA as part of the last user fee agreement in 2012. And basically, the long story short, what they agreed to with contribution from corporate entities as part of their user fee was to conduct quarterly meetings about different disease areas. And the thought here was, if we can bring patients in more direct contact with medical reviewers at FDA, perhaps they will have a better understanding of what the patient's experience with the underlying disease and the available interventions so that it can impact kind of a more complete look into that disease as new products are coming forward. And I think critics of the program were very quick to step forward and say, why 20? Or why isn't my disease on the list? And I think that that was an issue of resources. That was an issue of time. The FDA is a limited resource agency. But one thing that they have done recently, at the end of 2015, they announced that that they were very interested in externally led patient-focused drug development meetings. So I think this provides an opportunity for any advocacy organizations that feel like they can bring together their constituents and give a complete picture to the regulatory authorities about the experience with the disease and the therapeutic options associated with it. They're trying to create a venue for additional input so that we can share with them experiences of patients that we've worked with in order to just help future understanding. So that's anecdotal information. I think it has, in some cases, proven to be very beneficial, particularly to a medical reviewer who may not have firsthand expertise or current expertise in different disease areas where the treatment landscape has changed recently. But to build on the anecdotal evidence, I think that at least I've seen a shift in advocacy over the last several years where it is more than just raising attention to the problems. So many organizations are extremely savvy and quite frankly have direct access to the patient population more than anyone else. So the data actually lies with those organizations. And we've seen some good examples recently of organizations who have been very data-driven in looking at ways that they can quantify benefits and risks, both with the disease and available treatments, but to really help provide a scientific and an evidence base for doing things differently. One example that I think is great here is in the muscular dystrophy field, where Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy worked with a group of advisors to really survey their membership to understand what endpoints were critical to them. And this resulted in them having the ability to work directly with the regulatory agency to construct guidance documents around the use of different endpoints to evaluate therapies for their diseases. And I think this was a positive experience for everyone that was involved in this, and there's a lot of opportunity to be able to do this in other disease settings. And the FDA has opened a program where you can submit to them a letter of intent of trying to do this. This is even being addressed in policy. We've tried to work on the Hill to have Congress give a directive to the agency to lay out some of these processes, because we're all limited by resources. So if we're going to take the time to set up registries, we want to make sure that they're as robust as possible, and we want to know that the information is going to be used and how it's going to be used, and have a way that you can work with the regulatory authorities closely so that the methodologies that you put in place for surveying your members or your constituents can be done in a way that that they are sure of the scientific rigor of the methods that are used, and hopefully that's a route to get this into the label so that it can be better communicated. So I think I'll just wrap up by saying that there are a lot of opportunities in terms of finding ways to develop evidence as third-party entities that aren't necessarily developing drugs, and it's not just within the drug process, but we can be the ones to put forward new methodologies that are important to patients, help develop patient-reported outcomes that can then inform the future of drug development and provide the evidence to create future policies to make sure that our constituents' views are being well represented in the scientific methodologies of the future.